I never thought that a simple parking mistake could cost me everything. When my wife and I moved into Oak Ridge Estates, we thought we had found the perfect place to raise our kids. The neighborhood was quiet, well-maintained, and the homeowners seemed friendly. We were happy, until the fines started rolling in. It started small. A notice from the HOA claiming I had parked my car in the driveway for too long. Confused, I checked the bylaws. Nowhere did it say that a homeowner couldn't use their own driveway. I figured it was a mistake, so I ignored the warning. Big mistake. A week later, I received an official violation letter stating that I owed a $250 fine for unauthorized parking. I called the HOA office to dispute the charge. A woman with a clipped, impersonal tone answered. I explained that my car had always been in my driveway, never on the street, and asked why I was being fined. She coolly responded, "The HOA board has updated the parking regulations. You are required to keep your vehicle inside your garage at all times." I was stunned. That rule hadn't existed when we moved in. "When was this rule added?" I asked. "It was recently decided by the board. All changes are within the HOA's right to enforce." I argued that I had never received notice of the rule change, but she wouldn't budge. Pay the fine, or it would accrue additional penalty. Frustrated but not wanting to cause trouble, I decided to just park in the garage from then on. I paid the fine and thought that was the end of it. But it was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, another fine arrived, this time for improper lawn maintenance. According to the HOA, my grass was exactly 1.5 inches too long. I checked, and sure enough, my lawn was neatly trimmed, not overgrown in the slightest. This time, the fine was $500. I knew this was absurd, so I refused to pay. That's when things escalated. The next week, I received another notice. Failure to pay HOA fines. Additional late fees applied. My $500 fine had doubled to $1,000. I called the HOA office again, demanding an explanation. "You have 30 days to pay, or the balance will continue to increase," the woman on the phone said coldly. "If the violation remains unresolved, further action may be taken." "What does that mean?" I asked. "If fines remain unpaid, the HOA reserves the right to place a lien on your property." That's when I realized this wasn't just about a couple of fines. The HOA was targeting me, and if I didn't fight back, I could actually lose my home. I started looking into my neighbors' experiences. To my surprise, many of them had similar horror stories. One woman, a widow in her 70s, had been fined thousands of dollars for an unapproved garden decoration. Another family received violations for leaving a bicycle on their porch. Every story was the same: random, excessive fines, threats of late fees, and the looming risk of losing their homes. It became clear. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were running a business, a ruthless one, designed to bleed homeowners dry. Determined to fight back, I gathered every letter, fine, and document I had received. I studied the HOA bylaws, looking for inconsistencies. That's when I found something interesting. Any rule change affecting fines had to be voted on by the homeowners before enforcement. There had never been a vote. The board had illegally imposed these fines without proper procedure. Armed with this information, I decided to confront them directly at the next HOA meeting. I wasn't going to be another homeowner bullied into submission. I was going to make them answer for what they had done. I walked into the HOA meeting determined to make my voice heard. The room was filled with neatly dressed board members seated at a long table, their faces smug and indifferent. Homeowners sat scattered across the room, some whispering quietly to each other, others staring at the floor, avoiding eye contact. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel the weight of years of silent compliance pressing down on everyone in the room. When the board opened the floor for homeowner concerns, I stood up immediately. "I'd like to address the recent fines I and many others have received," I said firmly, holding up a folder filled with violation notices. According to the HOA bylaws, any change in regulations that results in fines must be voted on by homeowners before enforcement. There was no vote. Silence. The board members exchanged glances, their confident expressions wavering for just a moment. Finally, the president, a thin man with sharp features and an air of condescension, cleared his throat. "The board has the right to make adjustments to community standards as needed." "That's not what the bylaws say," I shot back. Section 4.2 specifically states that any fine-bearing amendment must be passed by a homeowner vote. You're enforcing rules that were never legally approved. A murmur spread through the audience. People began flipping through their copies of the bylaws, realization dawning on their faces. The president's confident smirk disappeared. "We will look into that matter," he said quickly. "But in the meantime, homeowners are expected to comply with all HOA regulations." I wasn't letting him off that easily. "And what about the excessive fines? People are being charged for things as ridiculous as having a bicycle on their porch. And the parking fines? They were never in the original agreement. I'd like to see documentation proving that these changes were legally passed." The board members stiffened. I knew I had them cornered. Finally, the president sighed. "We will review the concerns and respond in due time." Meeting adjourned. That was it. They ran. No discussion, no defense, just a desperate attempt to shut me down and hope the issue disappeared. But I wasn't going to let it go, and neither were the other homeowners who had just witnessed how easily the board had buckled under scrutiny. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me. Greg, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, shook my hand. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to them for years," he admitted. "Count me in." Maria, a single mother who had been fined for her kids' sidewalk chalk drawings, nodded. "I want to fight this too." Word spread quickly. Over the next week, more and more residents came forward, sharing their stories and offering to help. We formed a group, collecting evidence, logging every unjust fine, and preparing a formal complaint to present to city officials. That's when the retaliation began. One morning, I woke up to find another violation notice taped to my door, this time claiming my front porch light was too bright. A neighbor, Jason, received a notice for having his garbage cans out 15 minutes past collection time. Another family was fined for having a small flower pot that wasn't on the approved list. It was clear the HOA was trying to break us down. But instead of scaring people off, their aggressive tactics only made the community more determined. People were furious. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out were now openly defying the HOA. The board had spent years ruling through fear, but that fear was starting to crumble. Then, just as our movement was gaining real momentum, I received something that made my stomach drop. A final notice of delinquency. The HOA had tacked on more fees, pushing my total balance to just over $10,000. And if I didn't pay immediately, they would place a lien on my house. I was officially at risk of losing my home. The notice in my hands felt heavier than paper. It was a threat, a warning that the HOA was done playing games. If I didn't pay the now staggering $10,000 balance, they would take legal action to place a lien on my home. It wasn't just about fines anymore. They were trying to take my house. I had two choices: cave in and pay the money, or fight back harder than ever. I chose the latter. That night, we gathered at Greg's house. More people showed up than ever before. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA now saw it for what it was: a corrupt machine designed to drain homeowners of their money. Maria, who had been researching legal precedents, had good news. "This isn't just unethical," she said, tapping on her laptop screen. "It's illegal. The HOA can't enforce new fines without a homeowner vote, and they definitely can't threaten foreclosure over these bogus charges." We drafted an official complaint to the city, detailing the illegal rule changes, the intimidation tactics, and the unjust fines. We attached every violation notice, every photograph, every piece of evidence we had. But we knew that wasn't enough. The HOA had money, lawyers, and influence. We needed something bigger. Jason suggested bringing in the media. If people knew what's happening here, it would be impossible for the HOA to sweep this under the rug, he argued. It was risky, but we were out of options. The next morning, we contacted a local news station. To our surprise, they were very interested. Apparently, HOA abuse was a growing problem, and they were looking for stories to cover. That evening, a news crew arrived in our neighborhood. They filmed interviews with homeowners, captured footage of the ridiculous violation notices, and even recorded a segment on how the HOA was trying to force me out of my home. The story aired the next day, and the fallout was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage. People from all over shared their own HOA horror stories, and within hours, the situation had drawn attention far beyond our small neighborhood. The pressure was building, and the HOA was starting to crack. Then, just when it seemed like we were turning the tide, the HOA made their most desperate move yet. 2 days after the news story aired, I received an official letter from their attorneys. The HOA was suing me. The claim? Defamation. According to the letter, by speaking to the media, I had damaged the HOA's reputation and incited unrest among homeowners. I should have been terrified. A lawsuit meant legal fees, court battles, and months, if not years, of stress. But instead, I felt something else. Relief. Because this lawsuit meant they were afraid. The HOA wasn't suing me because they thought they would win. They were suing me because they were losing. I contacted a lawyer that same day. To my surprise, he agreed to take my case pro bono, explaining that he had dealt with corrupt HOAs before and wanted to make an example of this one. "They've made a mistake," he told me confidently. "They're trying to silence you, but all they've done is open themselves up to more scrutiny." What happened next was beyond anything we had imagined. The city announced an official investigation into the HOA's practices. Homeowners from neighboring communities started coming forward with similar stories. More news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, our local HOA was being scrutinized on a national scale. And then, the breaking point. A whistleblower from within the HOA board came forward. The former treasurer, who had quietly resigned months ago, reached out to my lawyer. He provided internal emails, financial records, and documentation proving that the board had been illegally imposing fines and funneling the money into discretionary projects that benefited them directly. The evidence was undeniable. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. They were committing fraud. And now, they were about to face real consequences. The whistleblower's evidence was the final nail in the coffin. With financial records proving fraud, illegal fines, and self-serving board decisions, the city had no choice but to act. A full-scale investigation was launched, and suddenly, the HOA board found themselves in the hot seat. The media, already buzzing from our initial story, went into a frenzy. News outlets aired exposés on corrupt HOAs across the country, using our case as the perfect example of unchecked power gone wrong. The board members began panicking. Some tried to distance themselves from the scandal, resigning before the full investigation concluded. Others dug in, trying to defend their actions, but the evidence was too damning. The City Council announced an emergency hearing, summoning the HOA board to answer for their actions. I attended the hearing, sitting in the front row with my neighbors by my side. We had fought this battle together, and we were about to see justice served. The room was packed, not just with homeowners from our community, but with people from nearby neighborhoods who had experienced similar HOA abuse. The city investigator read out the charges: illegal enforcement of fines, financial mismanagement, misuse of HOA funds, and threats of foreclosure without legal backing. One by one, homeowners stood up to give testimony. Greg spoke about his years of silent frustration. Maria described how she was targeted with petty fines simply for letting her kids play outside. I told my story of how the HOA had tried to take my home over bogus charges. The board members had no defense. They sat there, stone-faced, knowing there was no way out. The verdict came swiftly. The HOA board was to be dissolved immediately. Not only that, but individual board members were facing lawsuits, and the city announced they would be pushing for criminal charges against those involved in financial fraud. The crowd erupted in applause. We had done it. We had taken down a corrupt system that had ruled through fear and intimidation. And now we were free. In the weeks that followed, a new HOA was formed, one run by actual homeowners who wanted to restore trust, not exploit their neighbors. The ridiculous fines were voided, and those who had paid them were refunded. The lawsuit the HOA had filed against me dropped. The lien they had threatened against my home, gone. For the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a real community again. No more yellow envelopes taped to doors, no more fear of stepping outside and wondering if you'd be fined for something ridiculous. We had fought back, and we had won. Standing on my front porch one evening, watching kids play in the street without worry, I took a deep breath and let the reality sink in. This wasn't just about me or my fines. This was about all of us, about the right to feel safe in our own homes, about not allowing power-hungry individuals to dictate our lives. HOAs were supposed to protect communities, not terrorize them. And thanks to our fight, Oak Ridge Estates had become what it was always meant to be: a neighborhood, not a battleground. We had proven something important. No matter how powerful they think they are, corrupt HOAs can be beaten. And no homeowner should ever feel powerless against them again.